in Lexington, Kentucky, actually just down the street from the offices of the Diocese of Lexington, and I've been serving at EMM since 2013. So I'm going to talk with you a bit today about what led me into this work, the Episcopal Church's work in refugee resettlement, why the Episcopal Church has a history of advocating for and caring for immigrants and refugees and other displaced persons, and then a bit about our current day work, the way that we've expanded our programming, but also the way that we're building networks across the Episcopal Church to support migration ministry. So there's kind of three different inputs that led me to work for EMM. One is my growing up in the Episcopal Church. When I was a young child attending Christ Church Cathedral in Lexington, Kentucky, my family was part of a co-sponsorship team that co-sponsored a family from Bosnia. And I developed an affectionate and close relationship with the mother in that family. She could not speak English well, but that didn't much matter. Our family would have dinner with the family. She would make me these adorable blouses and skirts. And so from a very young age, it was just very much a part of being a follower of Jesus, of being part of my church, that part of our job is to welcome newcomers and to welcome refugees. Even though at the time I was a little kid, I didn't really know what that meant. I just knew that this was our job. If we follow Jesus, we welcome and we love our neighbors. There's multiple threads that lead the Episcopal Church to be present in the work of migration ministry and welcome. So one of them is, of course, our scriptural tradition. We are told time and again throughout Scripture, there's this movement of God trying to lead the people of God to being a people who not only offer hospitality, but who also are doing away with these binary categories of us versus them. So there's a definite through line in Scripture of trying to open up the people of God's notion about who we are, this broadening and enveloping sense that we, all of us together, are all people of God and all deserving of love and care and support and welcome and a sense of belonging to community. So that's one definite thread, is the scriptural tradition that we are part of. Another thread, I would say, for us as Episcopalians is definitely our Baptismal Covenant. We promise to respect the dignity of every human being. We promise to love our neighbors as ourselves, and we recommit and reaffirm these promises every time there's a baptism. Every time we have a reaffirmation of our Baptismal Covenant, we re-center ourselves in this call and in this identity that we have as a people of faith to this work. So I think that's another reason why the church is in this work, is because our call as followers of Jesus, as people of God, is to bring all of God's creation into wholeness, into relationship of reconciliation and love and mutual care with one another. So that's definitely another thread. And then I would say, certainly in the 20th century, continuing into the 21st century, the Episcopal Church has not been without blemish. We have not been without our faults that we continue to observe and critique and learn from. But we've also had this steady drumbeat of social justice activism in the Episcopal Church for decades. One of the things I often have heard from individuals who perhaps take issue with positions the Episcopal Church has taken on any number of social justice issues, including immigration, has been that the Episcopal Church is getting too political. But to that I would counter, the Episcopal Church has always stood for its values. It's the political ecosystem, kind of the context or the matrix that we're placed within, that continues to change. But our job as followers of Jesus is to stay true to what God has asked of us. So if we look at just a few historical dynamics in the 20th century that are very reminiscent of things that are happening today, one is in the 1920s and 30s, in the United States, there were incredibly racist restrictionist policies that were our country's immigration policies. These grew out of the 19th century with the Chinese Exclusion Act. Later in the early 1900s, there were various restrictionist policies passed by Congress, signed into law, that restricted the number of people who could come into our country to a percentage of their population that was present in the country, first in the 1910 census, and then a later law was passed that looked back even further to when populations of, quote, undesirable immigrants were even lower in the country. So we have this racially restrictive system that starts really from the foundation of the United States, but we can certainly see it in immigration law in the late 1800s, early 1900s. At the same time that those laws were on the books, not only in Europe, but here at home, there was this rising tide of anti-Semitism. And then you have in Europe the rise of the Third Reich in Hitler's regime. The American press and political system started to see what was happening and react to it, but there was no space in our country's immigration law to allow for immigrants who were fleeing that kind of persecution and genocide to come here and find safety. Those folks who were fleeing didn't fit into the racially restrictive categories that were on the books. So what happened in the 1930s and early 1940s was that it was the faith community. It was the Episcopal Church, the United Methodists, or the forerunner to the United Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Catholics, the Jewish community. It was the faith community that came together and called the country to account, to stand up for the values that we've enshrined in our country's founding documents, but we've never quite fully lived into. So it's important to note that it's not only our scriptural tradition, it's not only our baptismal covenant, it's not only the church continuing to challenge itself to live into the dream of God's kingdom, but also the Episcopal Church participating as a vital citizen, speaking against unjust laws and systems that prevent the protection and the safety of God's beloved children. So I mentioned all these different things to also bring to the fore that our most recent kind of bubbling up, boiling point of xenophobia, anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, anti-Muslim rhetoric is very sadly not new. It's in a way, just to borrow a cliche, it's just about as American as apple pie. And the circumstances that led the Episcopal Church to be involved in this work in the late 1930s and to advocate for human rights of seeking asylum, to advocate for protections, we are living in a time that's not dissimilar from the time where the Episcopal Church really decided that it was going to be part of this. So to those who might say to me that when the Episcopal Church makes a statement in support of refugee resettlement, when the Episcopal Church makes a statement in support of the human right to seek asylum, or for DACA recipients, or that temporary protected status should be extended for a particular group, sometimes folks say we're being political, but I would counter, we're not. We're being the church, and we are doing what the church has always done when it's at its best. We are standing up for our siblings who are in need. We're standing up for the dignity of every human being that we promise to commit to at our baptisms, and we are loving our neighbors as ourselves. Now I'd like to talk a bit about Episcopal Migration Ministry's work with refugees, and also a bit about our expanding programming to serve other groups and also to galvanize and provide supportive mechanisms for ministries across the church. So to set the global context, we are living in an era of forced displacement. The United Nations called the decade of 2010 to 2019 a decade of displacement. In 2019, 79.5 million people were forcibly displaced. Of that number, 26 million were refugees. We'll speak about what that means in a moment. 45.7 million were internally displaced within their countries of origin, and then another 4.2 million were seeking asylum in a country outside of their country of origin. So As I walk us to talking about EMM's programming, I want to speak a bit about what are these different terms and definitions, how are folks grouped into these different categories. For individuals who are in need of humanitarian protection, they fall into a few different buckets. The one that I'm going to spend most time talking about in the next minute or so are refugees, and then later we'll talk about asylum seekers within the context of the United States. Refugees, by international law and in the United States law, are individuals who, owing to a well-founded fear of persecution on account of their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion, have been forced to flee their home country and seek safety in another country because their home governments are unable or unwilling to provide them protection. So refugees are the population of concern that the United Nations Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, was set up to provide protection for. The UN Refugee Agency is charged with finding a solution for these different individuals and groups of refugees. And there are three what are called durable solutions for refugees. Refugees can voluntarily repatriate. They can choose to go home when it's safe to do so. That's always the first priority. No one wants to leave their homes. And so the first priority is that when it's safe and when situations have stabilized, people can voluntarily repatriate. That's a very rare occurrence. There are multiple protracted refugee situations all over the world where people cannot go home. So the second durable solution is local integration. So this would be a refugee has fled from one country, they've crossed a border into a second country. That country is called the country of first asylum. It's the first country they went to that was providing them a means to seek asylum or protection. In those countries, some of these countries have policies where refugees can receive work permits, their children can enroll in school, they can start to access many of the same systems and assistance that permanent residents or citizens can access. And so that's when we see refugees who can be locally integrated into that country of first asylum. Again, that's a very small number of people. So the third durable solution for a very small group of individuals who cannot go home, they cannot locally integrate, and most oftentimes they fall into another vulnerable category. Those individuals could be referred by the UN for resettlement in a third country. And we say third country because they fled their first country, their country of origin. They went to a country of first asylum, that's the second country. And so we call the third durable solution third country resettlement. So the UN will identify groups of refugees who are particularly vulnerable and in particular need of the life-saving option of resettlement. And they will refer cases to various resettlement countries based on those resettlement countries' own systems and what their resettlement priorities are. Once refugees are referred to the United States for resettlement, they go through a lengthy, multi-month, oftentimes many-year process of vetting. They go through security vetting through multiple different federal departments and agencies, including the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the National Counterterrorism Center, the Department of Defense, and a few others. So all of these checks are cross-referencing until the time that the refugee's travel is scheduled. When their travel is scheduled, they also go through an extensive medical screening to make sure that they're not going to travel with any communicable diseases, but also to ensure that when they are resettled, their medical needs can be provided for upon their arrival. So they go through all of this processing overseas, while at the same time in the United States, there are 9 national agencies that hold contracts with the Department of State for refugee reception and placement. Episcopal Migration Ministries is one of those 9 national agencies. So we work with our State Department colleagues and the other agencies to identify refugees whose travel is scheduled. And there's a meeting that happens usually weekly where the 9 agencies determine where refugees will be placed. Placement decisions are made based on whether they have family relationships here, so they can be reunited with their families, also based on where there's the linguistic and cultural capital, if you will, capacity in local communities to welcome a family from a particular linguistic group. Also such things that our local offices monitor are housing stock, employment. They stay in very close contact with their municipal governments, with the healthcare providers in their area, with the school systems. All these different things are happening at the local level, at the national level, and at the international level that allow for refugees to be resettled into local communities. So in EMM's network, we have 12 local affiliates who spread from as far west as Seattle and Los Angeles. Our furthest east affiliate is probably New Bern, North Carolina, in the eastern part of the state of North Carolina. And we, EMM, have staff who are working with the State Department. The State Department in turn is working with folks overseas. And then we have got staff who are working directly with our local offices, and our local offices in turn are working with congregations and those community stakeholders I mentioned. They're also working with volunteers, church groups, and civic groups that want to co-sponsor and welcome their newest neighbors to their communities. So this is really a big, massive program, and it all was born out of the Refugee Act of 1980. So in addition to EMM's resettlement work, EMM has slowly but surely built out programming and church engagement in two other areas. One is asylum, and this other area is immigration detention. So to speak briefly about that third area, then I'll return to asylum. In mid-2020, after many conversations and relationship building with folks all across the church, the EMM's church engagement unit decided that we were going to formalize these relationships and these networks that we were part of into an immigration detention ministry network, and then also into an asylum ministry network. So in January of 2021, those two networks came together, and they continue to this day. It's really a wonderful, energetic space where we've got folks from Georgia talking with folks in Oregon, folks who are in California talking with folks who are in Illinois, Texas, Maine, all over the country. And some of the folks in the ministry network are involved in local ministries. They provide services, they do detention visitation. Others are involved in advocacy. So they are really involved in shutting down detention centers in their local areas. They're involved in advocacy to members of Congress. So it's really runs the spectrum of what people are involved in, and we all come together to share, to pray, to be in fellowship with one another, and also to adopt some of each other's best practices. So the second area that I wanted to mention is our building out of programming for asylum seekers. Like refugees, asylum seekers have fled their home countries because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution. However, they've not yet received that legal refugee or protected status. Asylum seekers also don't have access to any of the supports that are available to refugees who arrive through the Refugee Resettlement Program. Asylum seekers must receive asylee status, meaning they must win their asylum case before they can access any supports or public assistance. So just to boil it down, the difference between refugees and asylum seekers lies not in their stories, but in their official legal status. Refugees have already received refugee status, where asylum seekers who are presenting themselves in the United States seeking asylum are seeking that protected status. EMM also has two small but growing programs to serve the needs of asylum seekers directly. One is a case management program that we are piloting in our affiliate in Austin, Texas. And this is a case manager who provides services specifically to asylum seekers. Asylum seekers do not have access to any of the public assistance or benefits that refugees do. Once their refugee claim, their asylum claim is adjudicated and they receive asylum, they become known as asylees, and then they are eligible for many of the same public assistance benefits that refugees are eligible for. But there's a big gap. There's a gap for asylum seekers who don't know where to turn for support. They don't know how to access medical care. They don't know that their children can enroll in school. They need to find an immigration attorney. All of those services can really be addressed by a case manager. The other program that we're very excited about that we just launched in 2021 after about a year or more of development is our Neighbor to Neighbor program. So many asylum seekers who either present themselves at the border or who are in detention and could be released to a sponsor need the support of a welcoming community so that they have a place to live, so that they have friendships and a sense of belonging while they go through this very difficult adjudication process. They need the support of an attorney, but really they need a community that comes around and alongside them as they go through this. So we launched a program called Neighbor to Neighbor, where we train congregations to be that community. Neighbor to Neighbor congregations first go through a discernment phase to determine whether or not they want to go through our 8-week training program. Our 8-week training program is very intensive. We talk about anti-racism, we talk about accompaniment practices, we look at trauma-informed ministry and care, all these types of things. So it really helps congregational groups get a sense of the complexity of the work, but the joy of the work as well. At the end of the training, there's more discernment. The congregation can take what they've learned from the training and put those learnings to use in a number of ministry contexts. Or if they do feel still called to moving forward into a match with an asylum seeker or family, we will work with our partners across the border, but also other agencies that we are colleagues with to match an asylum seeker or family to that congregation. Either for accompaniment, which is more of a friendship and walking alongside model, or for a sponsorship model, which is all that accompaniment is, but also oftentimes has a larger financial commitment and a commitment to providing housing and other supports until the individual has their work permit and is able to stabilize and be self-sufficient. Thank you so much for having me. I hope that some of what I've shared with you today was educational, was provocative, and hopefully makes you a bit excited to learn more about EMM's work and how you can get involved. You can learn a lot more about all that we do, from our programs to our church engagement work, on our website, episcopalmigrationministries.org, and you can find us on social media. On all platforms, we are EMM Refugees. I also hope that you'll check out our website for many other resources, including toolkits, podcasts, book discussion guides, liturgical resources, Christian formation resources. And also, please especially check out episcopalmigrationministries.org